Hello again, Year 7. So before we go on to our main lesson, which is our final lesson actually on space, we have three more questions for you. Again, two are ones that I expect all of you to do. And then there's a challenge that I would hope as many of you will try as possible. It's something that you can also look up as well. Okay, so have a go at those. Pause the video and then see how you get on. So how did you get on? Hopefully question number one was something that was familiar to you. If you could remember from our previous lesson on the Earth, that the imaginary line that the Earth spins around is called the axis, from the North Pole to the South Pole. Now, what do we call a collection of stars that make a pattern in the sky? We call it a constellation. And the last one's a slightly more tricky one, but if you were able to access the internet, perhaps you might have been able to search for the answer to this question. What do we call any other planet which is in orbit around a star that is not our sun? They are called exoplanets. So today's title is the Moon. We've looked at the Earth, we've looked at the solar system. The other important body in our solar system that we need to look at is our very own Moon. Okay, and the learning objectives for this lesson are to be able to describe what we call the phases of the Moon, to be able to explain why we see the phases of the Moon, and finally to explain why eclipses happen. There are two types of eclipses. We'll look at them in more detail shortly. One is the lunar eclipse and the other one is the solar eclipse. So first things first about the Moon. There are many man-made satellites that are orbiting the Earth, but there's only one natural satellite of the Earth, and that is our Moon. And it takes 27 days and 7 hours for the Moon to orbit the Earth once. Why does the Moon look different? If you ever look up into the sky, you've probably noticed that it appears as if the Moon is changing shape. It's giving out a different shape in the night sky on different nights. It appears as a bright object, but it doesn't actually have its own light. The only reason we are able to see the Moon is because it reflects light from the sun. So, as the Moon goes around the Earth, we see half of the surface only on full moon nights, okay, the 50%. In this particular picture over here, what we see are two circles. The first circle is the inner circle of the Moon, and this diagram shows the actual illumination by the sun of the Moon. Okay, and the circle on the outside with the outer moons, that represents our view of how the Moon appears from Earth in the night sky. This diagram is quite similar to the diagram on the previous slide. This time we're just going to go through it in a little bit more detail, looking at the lunar month and the cycle of the Moon. So this lunar month is the period of time from one new moon to the next new moon, and that is about 27 days and 7 hours. Okay, so if we start with position 1, we can see that we call this the new moon, and that is where 50% of the Moon is facing us, but unfortunately for us that 50% is in shadow, and it's the other side of the Moon which is facing the sun that's lit up, the side that we cannot see, and the side that we can see is in complete shadow. Then we go to position 2, which we actually call a waxing crescent. Okay, a waxing means growing, and this Moon is going to be growing in size as we move along this cycle for a while. So if we go to position 3, we call this the first quarter. It's not because we can see a quarter of the entire Moon. It's actually a quarter in terms of the journey or the orbit or the cycle of the moon as it goes around the Earth. After the position number 3, the moon will move into position number 4, and we are getting quite close to full moon, but not quite there. It's called the waxing gibbous because it's still growing. And then finally we get to position 5, where again 50% of the moon is visible, and this time it's lit, so we get what's called the full moon. Then we go to position 6. Again, we end up with a gibbous, but this time it's actually called a waning gibbous because it's waning means it's fading away. And then we get to the 3rd quarter of our cycle, which is stage or position 7. And finally, we get to position 8, which is this time not called a waxing crescent, but it's called a waning crescent. And after that, we'll start the cycle all over again with the new moon. Solar eclipses happen when the new moon passes directly between the Earth and the Sun. This casts a shadow of the moon on the Earth and blocks our view on Earth of the Sun. Now, in the diagram on the bottom right, there's a photograph of what we call a total solar eclipse. Okay, now these total solar eclipses, they only happen when the moon's shadow completely blocks the Sun, as in this picture over here. Okay, the Sun is completely blocked by the disk of the new moon. Okay, normally we wouldn't be able to see or make out the new moon because it's in complete shadow, but as it's backed or perfectly aligned with the Sun, we can see the disk of the new moon. Okay, and it's obviously on this side in complete shadow. Now, when only a portion of the Sun is out of view, we call it a partial solar eclipse. Okay, now in general, solar eclipses last only for a few minutes as the moon casts only a small shadow on Earth. In other words, the moon's shadow covers just a small area on Earth. Now, if you look at the diagram on the left-hand side, which shows us the setup of how the solar eclipses take place, okay, what we should see there as well is the umbra and the penumbra. Okay, now if you're standing in the moon's penumbra, which is known as the partial shadow, you will only get a partial solar eclipse. Okay, the penumbra, as you can see from that picture, is the lighter outer part of the shadow of the moon. Okay, the Sun is only partially covered over here by the moon. When the Earth itself enters the moon's shadow, we see a solar eclipse, and that's regardless of whether it's a penumbra or an umbra. As soon as you're in any shadow of the moon, you will get a solar eclipse. Okay, but you will only get a total solar eclipse if you are in the umbra region. Okay, so the umbra covers a very, very small area of the Earth, as you can see on the diagram, whereas the penumbra covers a much, much larger area, sometimes the size of an entire continent and the size of an ocean. Okay, now in a total solar eclipse, the disk of the Sun is totally obscured by the moon. The Sun's distance, okay, this is quite phenomenal, is 400 times the distance of the moon from the Earth. And also the Sun's diameter is 400 times the moon's diameter. Okay, now because these ratios are the same, okay, you almost miraculously, but we know this is science, you actually find that the Sun and the moon seem to be, from the Earth, of the same size, even though we know quite well that the Sun is much, much larger than the moon, and in fact the moon is significantly smaller than the Earth. Okay, now just to be clear again, the only time in the lunar cycle that we can have the possibility of a total solar eclipse is when we have a new moon. Now the reason for that is because obviously that is the only time when the moon is going to be in between the Sun and the Earth. Okay, we don't get solar eclipses in reality all the time because the moon's orbit around the Earth is in a slightly different plane than the Earth's orbit around the Sun. Okay, so to get that perfect alignment, it just doesn't occur every full moon because they're both orbits of the Earth and the Moon are slightly different in terms of their planes. The Moon's orbit is slightly tilted about 5 degrees to the plane of the Earth's orbit. Okay, so just every time that we get a new moon, we don't get the solar eclipse. Okay. Lunar eclipses happen when the Earth's shadow blocks the sun's light, which otherwise would reflect off the moon. You also get something called total lunar eclipses, and they happen when the Earth's shadow completely covers the moon. Okay, so essentially what we're saying is, as you can see in the diagram, that the Earth comes in between the sun and the moon. Okay, and the moon passes into the shadow of the Earth, which is blocking any of the sun's light from getting to it. There is a little bit of light that is reaching the moon, and that is refracted or bent by the Earth's atmosphere. Okay, and this gives the impression of the moon looking a little bit reddish or brownish in color. Very, very beautiful thing to see. So sometimes you can get a moon that we call the blood red moon, and that happens when you get the total lunar eclipse. These things can last for quite a long time, and they're fairly straightforward to see. Okay, they're not dangerous as if you're looking at the solar eclipse. Okay, so everyone can see them, and they last about 2 hours. Okay, so there's something called the far side of the moon. Now, how does this come about? Well, the moon spins on its own axis. Okay, the time it takes to spin all the way around happens to be the same time it takes for it to orbit the Earth. Now, this means that the same side of the moon is always facing the Earth. That means that there is a side of the moon that we never see. This doesn't mean that there is a side of the moon that is always in the dark. When we see a new moon, for example, the sun is lighting up the side of the moon that we can't see. Okay,